We believe in a doctrine called dispensationalism. In other words, we believe in dividing verses to the right group of people and the right time period. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to combine all the verses together and come up with major wrong doctrine. One of the doctrines we believe in dispensationalism is a pre-tribulation rapture. So we're going to get raptured before the tribulation. And one of our powerful arguments to prove this is because we have to go through the judgment seat of Christ. Now the thing is that if you deny a judgment seat of Christ occurring while the tribulation is down there, if those post-tribbers try to insist that, they're going to try to insist that this judgment occurs after the tribulation. So this is called the millennium. In other words, when God comes down on the earth and rules the earth 1,000 years. That's when the judgment happens. That's what Satan Anderson claims. So that's his way out of this. We argue you have to be up here during the tribulation. That proves pre-trib. But he just simply says, no, we just put it down here. Now his proof text is Luke 19. Luke 19. Notice what the scripture reads right here in Luke chapter 19. And we will read verse 15. And it came to pass that when he was returned, representing Jesus, having what? Received the kingdom. So he conquered the world. He's already reigning in his kingdom, the millennium. And notice the judgment starts. Then he commanded these servants to be called unto him, to whom he had given the money, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading. Then came the first, saying, Lord, thy pound hath gained 10 pounds. And he said unto him, Well, thou good servant, because thou hast been faithful in a very little, have thou authority over 10 cities. Some of you are familiar with that parable, right? That parable we famously use for the judgment seat of Christ. So because Stephen Anderson's familiar with that, he's going to try to prove this is after the tribulation, when God receives the kingdom. Now the thing is this, is that Bible believers, we do use Luke 19 to show what God will do at his judgment, but we don't refer to that solely to the judgment seat of Christ. It's not just doctrinal. We got to realize this. It's also a practical application. I mean, think about it. Let's assume God does this kind of judgment after he takes over the kingdom. If he does that kind of system at the judgment, when he takes over the kingdom, wouldn't it be similar with the judgment seat of Christ then, how he judges things? Yes. Wait, you just seem to infer, Pastor, that there are two different judgments. That's right. Look at Matthew 25. Matthew 25. There is no way in Hades that Satan Anderson is going to insist that this judgment seat of Christ is referring to after the tribulation. We believe in dividing. There's a judgment, not just judgment seat of Christ, there's a judgment of what? Nations. After he comes, after he sets up the kingdom, when he takes over the kingdom. If you insist this is the same thing as the judgment seat of Christ, there's no way Satan Anderson will go for it. Because look at Matthew 25. Let's see how this judgment works. There's a clear distinction. Matthew chapter 25, verse 31. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon, notice, the throne of his glory. See, he takes over the kingdom. And he starts his judgment, verse 32. And before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. In this particular judgment, he divides it, sheep and goats. Now, how do you become the sheep? How do you become a goat? There's no way that Christians who go through the judgment seat of Christ go to hell, but in this judgment you can, and it depends on your works. So don't try to make these two things the same. Look at Matthew 25. We'll look at verse 34. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, the sheep, Come ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. How did they do that? How did they inherit the kingdom? Verse 35, because they fed and gave water to drink to strangers. Verse 36, they clothed the strangers. Verse 37, they gave drink to strangers. Verse 38, clothed the strangers. Verse 39, they ministered to the sick and visited those in prison. This makes perfect sense because remember in the tribulation, what happens? You're persecuted by the Antichrist. You can't buy or sell without the mark of the beast. That's why you're hungry. That's why you're thirsty. That's why you're in prison. So it's important that you minister to these kind of people. That's why it makes sense this judgment of nation occurs after the tribulation, and these are the conditions to go to the kingdom. But if you don't do this, what happens? Oh, you're just backslidden. No, you go to hell. You go to hell. Let's keep reading right here. Verse 41, then shall he say also unto them on his left hand, the goat, depart from me, ye what? Cursed, into where? Everlasting fire, prepared for who? The devil and his angels. You go to hell. Why? Because verse 42, they didn't feed the hungry. They didn't give drink to the thirsty. Verse 43, they didn't clothe the strangers. They didn't visit the sick. And they didn't go to those in prison. Verse 44, 45, 46 continues with that thought. Now, see that? There is no way Satan Anderson is going to say that these two judgments are the same thing. Well, Christians are going to go to the judgment after the tribulation. Okay, then this is your salvation plan. Boom. But look at judgment seat of Christ. Go to two passages and we will finish. Look at 2 Corinthians 5. 2 Corinthians 5. We're going to look at two passages. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And we're going to look at Revelation 2. Revelation 2. Revelation 2. Excuse me, it should not be 2 Corinthians 5. It should be 1 Corinthians 3. 1 Corinthians 3. Sorry about that. So let's repeat the two passages. 1 Corinthians 3 and 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and we will also look at Revelation chapter 2. Notice how different this judgment seat of Christ is, and also notice this is going to be before it has to occur during the tribulation time period, before he enters the kingdom and takes over the world. You might say, why is that? Well, let's look at Scripture with Scripture. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Let's read verse 12. Now, if any man build upon this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble. See, you get gold. Verse 13. Every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it. There's a day that your works are judged. Judgment seat of Christ. Because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. See, this judgment tries your work. Verse 14. If your work is good, notice you receive a reward. Verse 15. Let's say your work is bad. Do you go to hell like Matthew 25 if your work is bad? No, if your work is good, your reward, your work is burned up, but you yourself is saved from the fire. Verse 15, if any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss. See that? Your work is burned. But he himself shall be what? Saved, yet so as by fire. Look at that. You're saved out of the fire, even if your work is poor. But right here, your work is poor, you go to hell. Now remember, these people get their gold, right? Look at Revelation 2. Revelation 2. Revelation chapter 2. And then notice right here about this rewards you get at the judgment. Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3, chapter 3. I don't know why I'm in a roll giving wrong verses. Look at Revelation chapter 3. And notice verse 18. I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire. What? Remember that? That's referring to 1 Corinthians 3, judgment seat of Christ. Gold tried in the fire. You get the gold tried in the fire as well as what? That thou mayest be rich, and as well as what? White raiment, that thou mayest be clothed. Notice you're clothed in your white raiment as well after this judgment, right? After you finish your judgment, you get your white raiment, you get your gold. You are garnered in your white raiment well long before the second advent. Look at Revelation 19 now. Revelation 19. Boom, boom, boom. Scripture with Scripture, and everything comes into light. Look at Revelation 19. And this is before he comes down. This is before he comes down. Revelation 19. You're already up there, finished with the judgment. Verse 7, let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to him, for the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife hath made herself ready. Right? The church is the wife of Jesus. Ready with what? To her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine what? Linen, clean and white, for the fine linen is the righteousness of saints. Boom, you're already clothed in, notice, your own righteousness, not Christ's righteousness. Why? It's your own righteousness. Because your works are judged. Remember 1 Corinthians 3? Your work is judged to get the gold out of the fire. And not only that, your clothes as well at Revelation chapter 3. And guess what? Revelation 19 shows you're finished with that judgment in your clothing and with your gold. And Revelation 19, when you're already clothed and with your gold, this is before his coming, because keep reading chapter 19. And he saith unto me, right blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he saith unto me, these are the true sayings of God. And I fell at his feet to worship him. And he said unto me, see thou do it not. I am thy fellow servant and of thy brethren that have the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. Look at that, the second advent, Armageddon, his coming. But look, when he comes down, you also come down already clothed. Keep reading right here. We're going to look at chapter 19, and we will read verse 14. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, what? Clothed in fine linen, white and clean. Oh, so these verses prove, look at that. The judgment seat of Christ, when looking at these three verses, gives you the clothing. And you're already clothed before you come down with Jesus Christ and take over the kingdom. And Satan Anderson and post-tribbers think this judgment occurs after he takes over the kingdom. That contradicts these scriptures. See that? The judgment seat of Christ it's still a strong proof text against a post-tribulation rapture, you notice. If he wants to say that judgment happens after the tribulation, then what I want you to do is this. I want you to agree with him, and I want you to jump to Matthew 25 and tell him this. You're saved by your works then. Go feed the hungry, give water to the thirsty, visit the sick, and go to prison. But Stephen Anderson's not going to go with that because he believes faith alone, not by works. You got him.